Hello and welcome back to Custodes Central. Today we're going to have a look at tier lists and list construction. This is part one of a multi-part series, and this is in the post-balance kind of universe. Let's see, what are we now in? We're now in 20th of July 2023. So about tier lists, what I would say is I don't really like tier lists in a vacuum, and that is because instead of just looking at unit profiles, looking at math, although this is all very important and kind of almost necessary, instead of just looking at the most efficient units in your army, you should be looking at what is my army trying to achieve and how does that interact with each other, right? So I always try and think everything is relative to the rest of your list. It's relative to the meta that you play in, it's relative to the terrain that you play in, etc. So what is your list trying to achieve? You want to do some things for primary scoring, you want to have some things for secondary scoring. Some people, they prefer to kind of bias one way or the other, and I think because we're a melee army, I think we should primarily be biased towards primary. Obviously there's more scoring potential in primary than secondary, but I think it's possible to grab as much as you can in relation to scoring secondaries without having to invest too many points. And I think there's definitely like a kind of sweet spot that you should try to aim for. Now, this is still just my personal opinion, because apparently you can just take 30 Guardians and just face roll the opponent. But I'm not sure that is stable, and until I see that repeated a few times, I'm probably going to stick to my opinion that you want to have some sort of blend between the two. And in relation to this, I think one of the things that I focus on a lot in list construction, and after I construct a list, I always try and do like 10 or 20 deployments on various maps to see, okay, how does this look turn one? And this is something that I think is criminally overlooked by most people when doing the list, right? So we talked about terrain. Obviously, if you play on more terrain, you've got more ruins. You've got more ruins without windows. Shooting becomes more important because you can't just like move from cover to cover and just eat them in melee, for example, right? And you have to understand that some units will make you stronger or weaker into some matchups. So, to me, just talking about tier lists in a vacuum just doesn't make any sense to me, right? So let's see, and also keep in mind when you make tier lists that not everybody has access to all the models. So if you don't have this model, the fact that two options exist may mean the second choice is significantly worse on a tier list. But if you don't have your first choice, that second choice goes way up in rankings, just because this fulfills a function that your army wants or needs. So let's go into the first kind of grouping of units here, and I would call this mandatory units, and this is what I call cheap bodies. Not everybody takes these, but I strongly recommend that you take them. And here our best units are Exaction squads. They're 35 points each. They're from Agents of the Imperium. They are super good. They've got a 4-up save, they've got 5 bodies for good screaming kind of footprint, and they've got a 5-up feel no pain if you take them with a medikit, which you always should. Now here I would say these are just standalone S tier units. You want to have additional drops. You want drops that can screen cheaply. You want drops that can do secondaries cheaply, that kind of thing. Now Prosecutors, because Exaction squads exist, they are significantly worse than Exaction squads. But if you don't have Exaction squads, because these models are hard to get, Prosecutors still become S tier. They're not S tier because Exaction squads exist, but if you don't have Exaction squads, I think Prosecutors are S tier. So if you can't get 2 Exaction squads, I think you should take 2 Prosecutor squads. They cost slightly more, but they primarily do the same thing, just not as well. So what are they doing? They're scoring your secondaries. They're cheap objective holders if they don't have, deep strike threats, or they don't have indirect fire, or they don't have towering, and you happen to be behind some terrain with windows or whatever, right? And they can do screening. So I just want to say, tier lists per se, not that great. You have to look at, the rest of your list and how can it function. What's our next mandatory unit? And I think our next mandatory unit should be at least 1 assassin, excluding the Culexus, right? Now, we're looking at Vindicare, Eversor, Callidus. They're all lone agent, and they all have either scout or infiltrate. And the thing that I can't stress enough, and I keep going on and on and on about it in videos, is the ability to start on an objective is massive, because turn 1 really dictates the pace of the game. If you fail to reach enough objectives on turn 1, on turn 2 you don't score. You either don't score or you don't score enough on primary. In addition, a lot of the secondaries are related to being on a point, and if you're not on a point, you can't score those secondaries. So what often happens is people build lists that don't reliably get onto 2 points turn 1. You know, they say like, oh, I rolled bad on my advances. Like, yes, you rolled bad on your advances, but you've also built a list that's capable of rolling bad on your advances, right? So, you know, rogue traders obviously can also infiltrate, I think, but then they're just too expensive. They're not a thing. So I think, in my opinion, having at least one assassin in your list is A tier. Now, I have different kind of tier lists between the assassins themselves, but your first assassin, being excluding the Culexus, is always going to be S tier. And the reason for that is they both have scout, or all three of them either have scout or infiltrate. And scout or infiltrate will always allow you to always be on an objective that you want to turn one. It's always. They might die for it, but they can always get there. And it's okay if they die for it, because you might force your opponent to overextend or commit a resource to cleaning it, and that allows you to trade up, something like that, right? What's the other thing that infiltrate can do is infiltrate can block scout moves to stop turn one charges, or to stop you being move blocked in your own deployment zone. And we'll cut away to TTS in a sec, just so you can see kind of how this works in practice, because unless this has happened to you, you kind of just think like, oh, I don't really understand why this is so important. It's not always going to happen, but the times that you can stop it happening, you're like, oh, I can see how this 80-point unit completely changed the flow of a game. Okay, so we're back on TTS. We're looking at a sample deployment. So let's say we are doing hammer and anvil, and we get this nice piece of terrain here that we can hide behind. We are relatively close to an objective. We're just looking for a 4 on a reroll of advance. Blade champion, not great, not bad, but we feel pretty comfortable that we can touch the objective, right? But let's say on the other side, they've got a scouting unit. Let's say they've got these Seekers of Slanesh. And what these guys do is they've got a 9-inch scout move. That's assuming they go fast, right? They move 14 and they get an advance. So let's see what advance roll they get. Let's say they get a 3. Moving 15 inches, right? Like so. Let's see, let's say they move 3, and then move another 12. Right? For 15 inches. Let's do it like this. Let's just do this in a straight line. And they're moving, let's say 6. Now they're moving 9. Okay. This now makes you getting to that objective very, very difficult. As a result, you're probably going to end up somewhere like, let's see what this charge would be, right? Let's say this is just all that happened. They don't have that many guns. We don't really care about it. Let's just roll our advance with the Blade Champions to see how we're going to get to this objective. And here you're probably going to have to advance and charge, right? This is the problem. And if they were smart, they'd make it so that, you know, there's no gaps for your models to be able to like move through these guys. Let's say just do it a bit like this, a bit like this, right? And move back ever so slightly. Because if you just move your 6 and you charge, there's actually 0 chance you're going to get up to there, right? So let's see, could you get there with an advance, right? So let's say you get a 4, we keep that because that's pretty good. 10 and 2, right? And here, you're going to struggle to actually touch this thing, right? Depending on what your advance roll is, right? Because let's say you now do your charge, right? You get a 7, let's say it's fine. You're going to find it very difficult to not get everybody in base to get it in a way that you can get onto this objective. This is awful. If you're stuck not on a primary, so you can fight first, you're up against Chaos Demons, this squad is going to have an extremely bad time, right? So, how do we stop this kind of situation from happening? Reset these guys behind the wall, just something like this. Doesn't have to be super clean, we just generally know what, has an idea what we're doing. So we put this Vindicare here, right? Let's just say in case they've got a few guns, right? This is now stopping all scout moves within 9. If you wanted to, you could sacrifice him up here. He needs to be 9 away from the thing, but this is stopping all these scout moves. So what's the result that happens? They can't scout you. Let's see, at all. Or maybe they can come like this a little bit. We don't really care about this. Right? Now they move 14 and they do their advance, right? Here, if they roll like a 3 or a 4, it doesn't matter, right? Let's say they can come like this. Right? Or maybe they charge and then they get to go like this, but they still need to be in unit coherency, right? This is now very easily chargeable by your squad in the return, and you can end up on the objective, so you can get fight fast. So all of this nastiness is completely avoided by being able to sacrifice an assassin that infiltrates. And in some matchups you'll have to decide whether that's worth it or not. With the Vindicare, it's 80 points, it's kind of expensive, I do not care. Like, I would happily do this. The same sort of thing applies when you're facing Astra Militarum and they're doing all their Scout Sentinels. And all they're really trying to do is clog up the mid-board so that you can't get onto the primaries. They're just trying to slow you down. They're trying to move block you in some way, right? Or they're just trying to buy one extra turn of shooting. One extra turn of shooting from the Astra Militarum is huge, right? And, I mean, they don't really care so much about stopping you from getting onto the mid-board, about fight first, but they do care about kind of basically slowing down the distance that you're able to get close to their army every single time. So they could be doing this with Scout Sentinels. This shuts this all down, because this just creates like this 9-inch bubble around them where there is no scout moves. Obviously they might have infiltrators as well, so you want to make sure that you put your infiltrate down early so your infiltrate doesn't get blocked by their infiltrate, for example. But this is one of the things that I continuously see people ignoring in their lists, and they don't see the value in it, or maybe it's just never happened to them, so they don't understand all the horrible stuff that can happen. What else could do this? Serbi Raiders could do this, although we don't super care about the Adneck matchup at the moment. But yeah, this is why I say, you want to have an infiltrate unit to be able to sacrifice this if you can. Or turn 1 charges. There are some combinations in World Eaters where if they go first, they get a scout move, and then they're setting up turn 1 charges, and as a result, you might have to step back very defensively because, say here, there's only one objective, right? So you could have 1 unit on this. Maybe you tail out 2 from this, but it would be very difficult to have a unit here that would be able to fight first unless it's a Trajan squad. So yeah, just really highlighting the value of having an infiltrate unit that you can sacrifice. And here, if you have to do it with a Callidus, it's expensive. You have to consider whether in the matchup it's worth to sacrifice their scout moves, like trade your Callidus to block their scout moves, or their infiltrate kind of stuff, or whether you'd rather. So here we want to see how the different assassins do different things, and this is why I think speaking of tier lists in a vacuum is not that great, right? So a Vindicare is your cheapest infiltrating unit, right? You can block their infiltrate with your infiltrate, assuming you get to deploy first, right? You can sacrifice it to move block their scout moves to stop them turn 1 charging, or to stop them move blocking you. And if you want, if the map doesn't require that sort of advanced infiltrate because everything's easy to tag turn 1, for example, right? Or it's still always a lone agent, so you can just put it on your backfield. It can always shoot something. Like, maybe it doesn't have like the best choice of shots in terms of like sniping a character or whatever, but it can still always shoot, usually. So this is, like, in my mind, a very safe choice, because you can infiltrate it and sacrifice it. It's cheap, it's fine, it's still lone agent, and it has a gun so it can shoot stuff, right? So an Eversor to me is worse than a Vindicare assassin. It serves a different function. Because it can't snipe stuff, it can't force battle shots, but it can kill lots and lots of trash. So a scout move isn't as good as infiltrate, because you can get blocked from your scout move by enemy infiltrate. But have it out, or it can also still hold a backfield objective because it has lone agent. So if you're worried about indirect or deep strikes, all that kind of thing, you can still block that. But the thing is, it doesn't really have a gun that counts, so it won't be able to project any force. So it will still be a lone agent, which is still worthwhile having in your army, but it just won't be able to project any force in the same way that a Vindicare can. But it can kind of threaten turn 1 charges. It can clean lots of trash that a Vindicare wouldn't be able to necessarily deal with, because they're more dealing with anti-elites. Now, a Callidus can infiltrate, but it can only really infiltrate if it's safe to do so, because if they've got scout moves, you might be blocking their scout moves, but it might open itself to a turn 1 charge. they might have other infiltrators that will kind of skirmish, and if they happen to go first, they might just kill your Callidus for free. So you have to be generally more careful with your Callidus than a Vindicare, because if your Callidus dies without getting its Reign of Confusion off, it's pretty sad. But sometimes you want to make the choice that you can trade the value of the Callidus to block their scout moves. So let's have a look at secondary list goals. Now, this is how I think about my lists. Every time I get to the end of the list, I think, okay, how many secondaries am I likely to score with this kind of list? So the starting points I always start with is 2 Exaction squads, or, you know, if you don't have them, you know, 2 Prosecutor squads. And from there, I think we can kind of assume we're going to score in the region of 25-ish secondary points. Now, I always like to add on a little bit more into this. So assuming that they don't have hardcore screening from your opponent, some lists just fully screen out, you know, their backfield and the midboard, and it becomes much harder to kind of do these secondaries. But assuming they don't do that, if you have 2 Exaction squads and 2 Allarus, this is what I would call kind of being light on secondary. This will give you your 2 strategic reserves from the Exaction squads. It'll give you a deep strike from the Allarus if you choose to do that, and you get the Golden Light redeploy. So this is kind of on the light end, and I think you'd score maybe 30-ish. A step up from that would be 2 Exaction squads and a Callidus. This is light but acceptable, and I think this will score you like maybe a few points higher than 30. So this is going to give you your 2 strategic reserves from your Exaction squads, and you get 4 deep strikes if you wanted them to, right? Because you can deep strike your Callidus, you don't have to start on the board, Reign of Confusion is still available, and every single turn you can lift it at the end of your opponent's turn and re-deep strike it. And this is kind of scary turns 2, maybe turn 3, but once you start cleaning out sections of the board, and they don't have so many drops left, and you know, if they're an immobile army, you can just this guy just goes on a secondary scoring rampage, or this girl, just deep strikes all the time. Wherever you want to be, you can be there basically, and score loads of points. A little bit better than this, I think, is 2 times 2. Well, not better, but better in terms of secondary scoring is 2x2 Allarus. This is giving you lots of things that you can deep strike, lots of things that you can Golden Light, and they also fight. So you can threaten primaries with these a little bit as well, depending on, you know, if they've under defended something relative to, you know, to Allarus, right? And for these purposes, whether it's 2 Allarus or 3 Allarus, doesn't really matter because they're fulfilling the same function. Obviously, 3 Allarus is going to be a little bit harder to deep strike because of the footprint, but also they can threaten more primaries because, you know, they punch way harder. Like 3 Allarus is like, that's a big deal, right? And even better than that for secondaries would be, you know, a Callidus and 2 Allarus. So this will give you the blend. You know, you got a bit of primary fighting here and secondary scoring. So this is very flexible, and I think if you go towards the region of like a Callidus and 2x2 Allarus, I think you're probably maxing your secondaries, but I think this is too many points invested away from your primary goal, which should still really be to score primaries and suppress your opponent's primaries to the extent that you can. So let's have a look at the argument that some people seem to be having about 2 or 3 Allarus. Now, 2 Allarus can action monkey. It is expensive, but they can deep strike, they can Golden Light. So you can start them on the board, and you might decide actually they want to be somewhere else in between turns. Although you have to make the election at the end of your opponent's turn before you see your tactical draws. But they can do it, and they can threaten trash on an objective. Now, 3 Allarus is a very expensive action monkey, but it can action monkey. And it can threaten a whole bunch of other stuff that 2 Allarus might be a bit iffy because, you know, you might lose one to shooting or something like that, right? Or you might lose 1 to combat, and then you only have 1 to strike back. But if you had 2 to strike back, you might just wipe the squad and take the objective, something like that. So what I would say with this is it's not really good to think about in a vacuum whether 2 or 3 is the better unit size squad. You have to think, how does this function in relation to the rest of your list? And with 3 Allarus, I would say it's worse at scoring secondaries, but it's flexible because it still allows you to score secondaries with them. If you had a unit of 5, you're never using a squad of 5 Allarus for secondaries. It's the biggest waste in your life, right? So you have to think, sometimes what your list wants is flexibility. And if that's what you want, then maybe 3 Allarus is better than 2. So the other thing to mention is that Allarus aren't only for scoring secondaries. They're also adding to your real fighting combat power, right? Like, they're no joke. They'll still mess a lot of things up. So this is it's like a combo unit, right? It's helping you score secondaries and it's helping you score primaries at the same time. in a way that Exaction squads, prosecutors are not really, right? They might shoot something, but like their output is a joke. So we're always trying to think of how do we spend our army points and convert them into victory points? Because victory points at the end of the day is the only thing that matters, right? We're always just trying to win games, we're trying to buy games. So this is why I think it's nonsensical to think of whether, 2 Allarus or 3 Allarus is quote unquote better in a tier list or anything like that. So Witchseekers, am I for real? I am for real. I am for real. And why do we like Witchseekers? I think Witchseekers are B tier, assuming assuming you don't have at least one assassin. And the reason is some people just don't have assassins. They don't want to run assassins because they want to keep it. They don't want to splash into Agents of the Imperium, whatever. If you don't have an assassin and you don't go Rogue Trader, I don't recommend you go Rogue Trader. You just don't have the Scout or Infiltrate moves. But a Witchseeker will give you a Scout move. So if you don't have... here we go. So if you don't have an assassin, you want at least one Witchseeker squad. Why do we want a Witchseeker squad?
Why do you like him?
Because he gets on base.
Because this gives you access to Scout. And Scout, along with a Blade Champion that you start on the board, is about the minimum that I would want in terms of reliably scoring 2 primaries turn 1. Not scoring, but touching 2 objectives turn 1. And the reason is the Scout will always let you get to an objective, and you can probably get there safely depending on your terrain. And the Blade Champion re-rolling advances, you're pretty likely to get there. Just the thing to keep in mind is that they don't have lone agent, so they might get shot. So just put them in a way that they can't get shot after their Scout move turn 1. And they're also good to start objective trade-up games. So what you might do is you might tag an objective with the Witchseekers, they might have to clean it with melee, and then that gets you in range easily for your melee units to make a charge, get onto the point and retake it and flip it. Or it might force them to expose like a shooting element from their army, and if you have shooting in your element from your army, you can now trade their shooting point for your Witchseekers, which is probably going to be a good trade because Witchseekers are like, they're 60 points, they're fairly cheap, and what they're using to shoot you off the objective probably is more than 60 points. You trade up for that with the Callidus. So here we're back into TTS, and we're looking at an example deployment on Hammer and Anvil using the GW layout for terrain with WTC style ruin walls, which are the tall windowless, and you treat these as windows counters being closed. So you can see we've got a nice bit of area to deploy, nothing could shoot you. Got a nice area to deploy, nothing could shoot you. You've got a bit of area here where nothing could, it'd be very hard for stuff to shoot you without overextending, right? The problem is though, from here, how do you get to these primaries? You could deploy here, but you're going to get shot by a lot of stuff. It's going to be ugly, right? So let's say, oh, it's okay, we've got a Blade Champion, we've got rerollable advances, right? You're here. Let's bump up the things, right? If we want to make this, we're going to need a 6 on our advance. We're re-rolling, but this is not reliable, right? From here, yes, you could get to it, but you're going to get shot if you don't go first, right? And here, let's see. Let's say we had a unit like this, right? So they've got a Blade Champion as well. Let's go slightly behind the line. Let's just ignore the fact that they can get shot from here. Let's just see what the distance is, right? Here we're going to need a 3. Looks like might even need a 3 point something. Maybe a 3 will do it. No, we just need a 3. But you could roll a 1 or a 2 here, which would be bad, especially if you didn't have a Blade Champion. So this is what I would say not reliable to get onto primaries. And I want to keep stressing this. If you don't get onto primaries turn 1, you usually start at a primary deficit. If you start at a primary deficit, you end up often having to take bigger risks to get back into the game, versus if you're not on a primary deficit, you can play the game pretty more safely, much more stable. You don't have to make big plays to try and get back into the game. What's the other thing that can happen if you're on primaries turn 1? You can get stuff like cleanse, you can get stuff like area denial. So this is all stuff that's super helpful. So here, this is what, for example, why I say take an Eversor, right? If you had an Eversor, you'd get a scout move, you'd move, let's say just here. It'd be pretty hard to shoot you with anything, and then in your actual turn, you could just touch the objective. You touch the objective here, you force them to either put more OC onto the point to steal it from you, or you force them to charge you if they charge you here, this is a very easy charge to make, right? You do your advance and you do your charge, or you just do your move and your charge. It should be pretty easy to retake the point. Or you put something like a Vindicare here, right? And this means that this can't be shot. Or you could do like the same thing with the Vindicare or the Assassin. You put it here, not touch the terrain. Turn 1, it can move, right? Tag the objective. It will die, but that's okay because it's bought you a turn for you to, you know, maybe you want to post up here with the unit, you do your advance and charge. You can get to here if you want to in turn 2, right? But the main thing is you want to be able to have an objective tagging the points. You want to force them to expose something to clean it or to kill it with melee. So why are Witchseekers actually not terrible? Witchseekers, if you can imagine them here, have a squad there. Let's have a squad here. Not saying you would have 3 units of Witchseekers, right? But let's see how a unit of Witchseekers in relation to each objective would be able to help you here, right? You scout move. Something like this. Very hard to shoot you, right? They have to like, can't get around this thing, can't get around this thing, right? And if they want this line, they have to move 12 from the line, and if they want to move 12 from the line, they have to start here. If they're starting here, they'd be exposed to potentially any shooting that you may have, or even just, you know, spear shooting would be able to get some of them, right, if they went fast. I put these guys here because probably you're going to use this real estate just here for your actual unit so they don't get shot, right? They don't have to go in a straight line, they just move 6, like this. They move 6, and from here, they're very comfortably getting onto the point. Right, what's the point of them comfortably getting onto the point? If they have to expose something to shoot this off, that's good because now you can pull out your tank or whatever, your shooting threats, or if you don't have shooting threats, you know, they might have to clean this with melee, for example, and you might even get something really sweet like area denial, which you may struggle to get. You know, this is also the kind of thing that would be really nice to do with like an Eversor, for example, right? You just put up here, you move. You do your area denial, if that happens to be a secondary, right? Or you do your cleanse, etc. Similarly for here, you know, you just move ever so slightly, and this like inch with a small unit is very big, right? Because now it cuts the angles massively that you can get shot. And how would I do it? Probably do it something like this actually. Right? This tiny inch makes the angles to get shot like significantly reduced. You basically can't get shot. And from here you're moving 6, and you just make your little advance, whatever that is, and you've now got like, you'd have 6 OC on the point, I think, because Witchseekers are OC2, I believe. So this is why Witchseekers, they're not great on paper, but if you don't have assassins, or you just want a little bit more reliability in terms of getting onto the point. So my rule of thumb is you want probably an assassin and one blade champion, right? This is kind of the minimum that I would have for a turn 1 deployment, because this gives you a rerollable advance to get onto a primary, and it gives you like a guaranteed one with a scout move or an infiltrate. On top of that, you can add Witchseekers, or you could replace them with Witchseekers. You know, they've got pros and cons. Witchseekers are slightly cheaper than Assassins, so you know, this is just how I do it in terms of points. You know, if you wanted something to reliably get onto it, I would always prefer an Eversor to a Witchseeker squad, but you know, it's obviously costs 15 points more. So, what are another mandatory unit that I think in terms of a Custodes army? And I think you should always have at least one Blade Champion, unless you're running, you know, 30 Custodian Guard, and you can just do whatever you want and face roll your opponent. So, I think Blade Champion is a really good unit, but why is it mandatory in my opinion, and why is it S tier? And you know, you get your rerolling advances, you get your rerolling charges, and you get your once per game advance and charge, right? But in terms of turn 1, really, I'm looking for the re-rolling advances, because re-rolling advances makes it pretty reliable for you to make 9, right, or 8. You're very, very, very rarely going to get a 7-inch advance. It's just like, it's going to happen 1 in 36 times. But this is improving your reliability to the point where I think I can rely on one assassin that scouts and or infiltrates, and a blade champion to tag 2 objectives turn 1 in no man's land. So this is why I usually want to have a blade champion start on the board, plus an assassin, or you could have an assassin and a witchseeker squad, or you could have like a blade champion and a witchseeker squad and no assassin, or you could have a squad with Ceaseless Hunter. Now, the reason why I say Ceaseless Hunter is this is a bit, your opponent can play around with it a bit if you fail your advance to touch an objective. If they tag it, you're probably within 9 for you to make your 6-inch move to move onto the point. You know, you've got a lot of OC. Assuming you're taking your Vex, you should be taking your Vex always, unless you're in the Terminator squad, in which case the Vex is way too expensive. Not for points, but in terms of reducing your combat output, right? So this will let you retake the point, but they might not try and do that, because, you know, an intelligent opponent will be like, okay, well, they're not on the primary, I don't need to let them take it with Ceaseless Hunter move, right, for example. So this here, I'm always looking for at least 2. So you want a Blade Champion slot on the board for your rerolling advances, or an Assassin, or Witchseekers, or a squad with Ceaseless Hunter. You want at least 2 out of these 4 options. So what else could you do? You could also reach objectives with other fast units, but they tend to be kind of too expensive, or they're not versatile. So something like Venatari, yeah, they'll tag an objective turn 1, but also they're hella expensive. Or like a Palace can reach an objective turn 1 because they move fast, but they're hella expensive. Or a Rhino, same kind of thing. So I really want to stress this. I keep saying it over and over and over again, and it's because, in my opinion, this is so important, right? How many objectives can your list reliably tag turn 1? And you want to be tagging at least 2 in No Man's Land, assuming you go first. So turn 1 is more important than you think. Why is this? Because being on the points gives you access to secondaries. So secondaries you can score that rely on being on points are Cleanse. So if you're on 1 objective in No Man's Land, you can score 3 VP or 5 VP if you're on 2. Deploy teleport homers if you're in the middle, assuming you can't get into their objective in turn 1, which I don't think there's any way that you can do in turn 1. So if you can get to the middle, you can deploy teleport homers in the middle for 3 VP. Extend battle lines. If you don't tag any objectives in No Man's Land, you just can't score battle lines. Extend battle lines for 5 VP. This is big. 5 VP, right? Just reach 1, you get 5 VP. This is big. Secure No Man's Land. This is also nice. If you score 1 in No Man's Land, you get 2 VP, and if you score 2, you get 5 VP. So you want to be able to score these, right? Area Denial. This will need you to be fully within 6 of the center. So sometimes you can do this, sometimes you can't, depending on your deployment and terrain and where you can set up, etc. But if you go first, you know, there's going to be nothing in the middle. So you score 3 if you're fully within 6 and there's nothing within 3 inches of the center. You know, that might happen if you go second, for example. If you go first, obviously there's going to be nothing within 3 of the center. Score 5. So I want to say scoring secondaries turn 1 is huge, because this relieves pressure on you to score, you know, high in your secondaries in turns 2, 3, 4, and 5, because you're capped at 40 anyway. So if you can score 5 to 10 secondaries on turn 1, this is massive. And if you can be on primaries turn 1, this is really good to set you up for scoring primaries on turn 2. And if your opponent just can't deal with an objective because they can't reach it, or you've screened it, or they don't have fast units, or, you know, whatever, they don't have indirect, you know, this is where the Eversor is superior to the Witchseekers, because, you know, it's got lone agents, they can't really just clean you off with indirect. If your opponent cannot answer your primary score in turn 1, you're probably just winning immediately. Because if they can't reach the primaries but you can, you've got primary advantage, you've probably got secondary advantage from turn 1, you're just in the driving seat for the game, and they're now going to have to make plays to try and get back in the game to catch up this deficit. But also, if you failed to score secondaries turn 1 because you couldn't reach the points and you were scoring like 5 or 0 primaries turn 2, you're in for a rough game. And you're going to have to make some plays to kind of, you know, kill their army or something like that, instead of just being able to play out the game. And you know, a lot depends on the secondary draws, but I want to stress to people, when making lists, think how your turn 1 is going to play, and get in the habit of practicing deployment on maps. If you're on TTS, you know, whatever map pack that you play on, or, you know, if you play on tabletop, just kind of imagine what the terrain looks like, you know, just with some colored paper or whatever. I don't really do this, but, you know, if you're really serious about getting better at 40k, this is what I do. Just practice deployments with the list that you write, and imagine how turn 1 goes. You know, can you reach these objectives? Can you get there safely, etc. So I think this is going to be long enough for part 1. We will go through the rest of the units in the index, including Forge World, and kind of my views on them. But I think this will set up a lot of people in terms of improving their lists as fast as possible, and I think this is worth getting up. So thanks for making it to the end of the video. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. If you are a subscriber but you don't have notifications turned on, please do turn that on, so you always get a little little icon that says when I post up a video. I think I don't post that many videos, but they're pretty high value to watch. So anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.